Hey guys, Chairman here, back on the Tressa's Collectibles channel with a deck profile for my World's Top 10 7 Deadly Sins, 6 Standby, and 2 Choice deck profile. I'm very excited to share this list and kind of go into the ins and outs of this special standby deck. The playstyle is very interesting and it's very explosive for a standby deck as compared to other standby decks in the current meta. Now, if you watched the previous 7 Deadly Sins deck overview video on this channel, you will know that we did have a 6 standby 2 choice list previewed there. And honestly, my list is not too dissimilar from that list back then, but the playstyle that I employ is very different from the playstyle that Mike employed in the gameplay video that Mike recorded with Randall. And so I'll be going into a little bit of how I've learned to play the deck and kind of the matchups and what you're looking out for as you are building and playing the deck. So a quick overview of the 6 standby 2 choice deck. There are 2 main components to this deck that makes it behave very differently from other standby decks, and these are the 2 main components that you want to really focus on when you're building and playing the deck. The first card is the Elaine Brainstorm. This card is very special. It is a one-of-a-kind brainstorm. There's no other brainstorm like it in all of the game, and it is central to the explosiveness of this deck and also our general game plan with how we want the deck to proceed. So the climax combo is not very special. When you play the associated climax, you can add the 2/2 bond from your waiting room to your hand. It is a very easy and simple +1, although pretty low quality because the 2/2 bond is not very good in your hand. You would rather have it in the waiting room at any given time. However, this is a very simple and effective way to replenish our hand, and the rest of the deck features a lot of filter tools to help get the bond back into the waiting room so that we can salvage it again with the Elaine Brainstorm combo. The Brainstorm effect is really what we're here for. Unlike other Brainstorms, you pay the cost by sending one character from your field to the waiting room instead of paying 1 stock, and you still rest the Elaine to look at top 4 cards of your deck, send them to the waiting room, and for every climax hit, you can look at the next up to the 3 cards of your deck, choose any of them to add to your hand, and put the rest into waiting room. So this kind of brainstorm profile is very good for standby because it allows you to add climaxes, and every standby deck wants to see the standby climaxes in their hands as much as possible. So this is a great way for us to continually play standby every single turn and just standby out increasingly big boards for our opponent to deal with. The second really cool effect about this, because it does not spend any stock, is that we can use it as early as turn 0. And generally speaking, that's what this deck wants to do. This deck wants to brainstorm turn 0 to start setting up the waiting room, mill through the deck, and get climaxes as soon as possible, whether that's adding them to your hand, or if you, let's say you don't hit any on your brainstorm, then there's a much higher chance that you'll trigger one of the climaxes since they were not in the top 4 that you milled clean. So yes, this is very central and integral to our game plan, and this is primarily the card that we're looking to abuse at all stages of the game. The second card that this deck abuses very greatly and is very integral to how this deck plays is the 1/1 Elaine Runner. Now this card is absolutely broken. Some of the older players may remember Data Life with the 1/1 Yoshino Runner. It's a very similar profile. So it's pay 1 to, at the start of your opponent's attack phase, you can select her and another one of your units and swap their positions. And then the second effect is obviously the Adachi effect when she gets reversed. If the character reversing her is a higher level than your opponent's level, you can send that character to stock, and then your opponent pays out the bottom card of their stock. So it hard removes any kind of early play that your opponent may have had. Now, the reason why this card is broken, even more broken than the Yoshino Runner specifically, is because it is a stock Adachi rather than a bottom deck Adachi. So bottom deck Adachi Yoshino clocks in at 3,500 power because sending a card to the bottom of the deck is considered more powerful than sending a card to your opponent's stock and having them pay out 1 stock. Because Elizabeth sends the stock, she is able to have 500 more power tacked in on her body. So she comes in at 4k power. And that's extremely relevant because she is our best turn 1 standby target. If we standby her out at turn 1, we can pay 1 on our opponent's turn 1 to swap her with a front row that has attacked. And generally speaking, most decks are not prepared to field a 4K attacker. Most decks are clocking in with 3500 beaters at level 0, so 4K is usually a number that's out of reach. Or if they want to play 4K attacker, they're not usually trying to use a 4K attacker to beat over some random utility that we're attacking with on the first turn. And so because of that, we're usually able to get a +1 very easily just by swapping her with our level 0, forcing our opponents to either crash into this 1/1, which is great for us. We save a card and they have to empty out a lane, or sometimes they'll even choose the side, in which case that's even better because then we take 1 less damage and we are still able to reverse their level 0 on the swing back because she's 4K. The fact that she's 4K at level 0 is honestly ridiculous and is one of the great ways that this deck gets super far ahead in the early game, more so than any other standby decks out there. Starting in the mid game and the late game, she also does a great job protecting our other standby targets, especially the 3/2 Meliodas, from being bombed by other Adachi effects. She can swap around the field, and the best part is that since we're playing a standby deck and we're winning on board, she often gets to direct because we've already won a lane, and then that enables her to protect another lane on the following turn. It allows future Elizabeths to continue directing. So she basically helps us open up lanes on our opponent's board and protect all our cards. So these two cards are kind of the centerpiece of the deck. These are the two cards you're really looking out for. Everything else really revolves around these two cards. Without either of these cards, this deck basically does not work or does not function at all. So really think about these two cards when you're playing and building the deck. This is what you're focusing around. Now let's get into the deck list. So starting off at level 0, we're running a lot of level 0s because we want to have an explosive level 0 game as soon as possible. We are playing 4 copies of the Elaine Brainstorm. This is a must-have. You want to see one of these in your opening hand at all time. Next, we are playing 4 copies of the Elaine Arisu. This is the SR version, which is the objectively better version, but obviously if you have the regular one, that's fine. Arisu effect is pretty standard. In English, a lot of people call this the Cowgirl effect because that's one of the notable Cowgirl cards. On play, you have 2 options. You can either reveal the top card of your deck if it is a traded character. In this case, if it is a Britannia character, you can add it to your hand, then choose any card from your hand, discard it. Second effect is you can discard a Britannia character in order to draw 1. So it's a double filter. You can change 2 cards in your hand with 2 cards from your deck. Great for getting rid of all the extra 2/2 bonds that we end up having and all our standby targets. Fantastic card also to sack with the Elaine Brainstorm. We just play the Elaine and then we sack her for the Brainstorm. Very nice. Depending on how you order the effect is depending on what you're looking for. If you want to draw a climax specifically, you want to use the top check effect first, because if you top check a climax, then you can use the discard effect to discard and draw onto the climax. If you want to hit on your brainstorms, then you will use the discard effect first, because then if you top check a climax, you are able to brainstorm out that climax. Or if you top check clean, then you're 1 card deeper into your deck so that you can hit that brainstorm. So generally speaking, if I have a standby in hand, I'll use the discard effect first. If I don't have a standby in hand, I'll usually use the top check effect first. You also want to use the discard effect first if you really want to get a specific card out of your hand. Sometimes if you use the top check effect first and you top check the choice, which is a card you don't want in your hand, sometimes you don't actually want to discard to draw that choice and you'd rather brainstorm. So if I have no standby targets in my waiting room and I have the standby target in my hand and I really want to get it into my waiting room, I'll usually discard first so I can draw and then top check afterwards. Even if I miss on the top check, I still have the standby target in my waiting room already. Next, we are running 4 copies of the Meliodas Rico from the second set. We call it a Rico because the Rico had the first top check salvage based on the level effect. Generally speaking, we are using this to get into our other level 0s. This is also a great level 0 to play after we've brainstormed once, so we can check the top card of a deck. If it's a climax, we can attempt to brainstorm again if needed. It's also a great card to play when we're already compressed and we're already pretty set up, because just knowing the top card of our deck can help us decide what to do on that turn. Yeah, this is just a great card to also get rid of climaxes and standby targets from our hand and get into our really strong level 0s that we can play. It's also one of our only ways to salvage like anything else in level 0. So if you're revealing like a 2, you can grab a counter. If you're revealing a 3, you can grab a Meliodas if you want. Fantastic all-around card to have. Also is yellow, which is relevant. Alright, next we're playing 4 copies of the level 0 Escanor. Escanor is incredibly important in our deck because if we miss our brainstorms, we're losing hand pretty quickly. Escanor is a great way to fuel that hand right back up. It's also a great way to get color. We do need yellow and red. We always really need red. And then so a lot of our red cards we don't actually want to level, because they're just really good to have in rotation. And Escanor allows us to choose a red card that we don't need anymore to put into our clock to later level for the rest of the game. Escanor is also really good at milling through our deck because he reveals 2 cards. The most important thing about Escanor, however, is because in this deck, we can sack the Escanor on our terms profitably, right? So a lot of times, other decks that are playing the Escanor Aqua style effect, if they want to use this proactively, they have to play another character over the Aqua or Escanor to use the on-death effect. However, in our deck, because we have the Elaine Brainstorm, we can use the Brainstorm to kill the Escanor and then activate the Escanor's on-death effect on our turn while we're milling for with the Elaine Brainstorm effect. So just being able to use that effect proactively without minusing resources is really great in this deck, and is one of the reasons why we want to have this in our deck and in rotation. It's just a really powerful card that we can utilize at level 0. Next, we're playing 2 copies of the Bond Bomb. This is the unique card that I've added into my list that Mike did not play with, and this came after a lot of testing for the current metagame and specific matchups. The thing that this deck struggles with the most is on-turn power. We're very big on our opponent's turn because we have the counters, but on our turn, we can't really get extra power. The Meliodas does have the on-attack pump 500, which does come up, but more so at level 0 rather than at level 1, 2, or 3. During that time, we need bigger power pumps, especially against specific meta matchups. And the specific meta matchup that this Bond is coming in for is the Kanata Marine matchup, because Kanata, she is not very big offensively, so the Kanata will usually side attack our characters, but defensively, because they have the 3k counter, Kanata can counter up to 15k power, and we really want to be able to remove and pressure the Kanata player so that they can't just loop forever and stabilize. And what the bot allows us to do is allows us to pump a 3-2 Meliodas to 15-5 if we have 3 or more other characters on the field. So a Meliodas with the 2-1 back row is 14. So as long as we have 3 other characters before we play the Bond, we can pump the Meliodas to 15-5, which is over any possible counter. And then with 1 Meliodas killing a Kanata and a 1-1 Elizabeth getting rid of the other Kanata, we can really put them back on resources and force them to spend their resources rebuilding rather than just healing down or getting surplus compression with stock or other stuff like that. So really important in that matchup. It's also red, so it's one of our better cards to level for red if we don't need the power in the matchup, but the power does come into play a lot, especially against standby matchups, and is a really great card to have. This also is a bomb at level 0, which means it shores up some of the weaknesses of our level 0 game, especially if we don't see a standby at level 0. We can still use this to pump one of our other level 0s to a respectable power to contest board, and it itself also can contest board as well. So really important card. The deck definitely smoothed out a lot after adding this. It just felt like at every given level I had options to contest board. I was doing something productive with the card slot. So very good card. I definitely would not cut it. I think this is very important to how the deck kind of functions, and it really fills in the gaps for when the deck needs the power, you got the power. Alright, and then last, of course, the climax swap. We're running the King Climax swap because it's the best one. Top check 2 is very relevant in standby because we want to trigger standby second, not first. And then obviously climax swap, so we can swap into standbys from choice if we draw into the choice, and into the choice at level 3 when we need to utilize the choice combo. Level 1, we are playing 4 copies of the Bond 1-1. This is not our ideal standby target, but we're running max copies of it because it is a standby target and it's also red. This is one of our preferred level targets for red because the 1-1 is great at level 0 and 1, and it falls off tremendously after that. And so generally speaking, we would want to level one of these, and we're running it at high copies so we can see some 1-1 on our field as early as possible. Run it just for the color. We actually don't have that many red cards, so it is, like I said, a lot of the red cards we would rather keep in rotation. The 1-1 is not one of them, so max copies to level with. Next, we have 3 copies of the 1-1 Elizabeth. This card is so important, that's why we're running 3. We want to see turn 1 as many games as possible. This card wins the game starting from turn 1 all the way to the end game. It's so super important for this deck. A lot of times we 3-stock encore this if we really need to keep it around. For example, if we have a 3-2 Meliodas in our front row and we know our opponent is running some kind of Adachi effect, by keeping this around, by 3-stocking it, enables us to protect the Meliodas that we standby out without losing that card. So it's worth the 3-stock a lot of times. Well, I guess it would be 4-stock because you're paying 1 for the run effect, but sometimes it's worth it, especially if you have a lot of stock. This card is super important at all stages of the game. It's great to have one in hand at all times so that you can play it into a specific board state where you want to be able to protect your units, or also like in certain matchups like Kanta Marine, just being able to drop these from hand for 1 stock and hard removing a Kanta is excellent. This kind of profile is super strong in standby because you can attack with it first and then it gets reversed, and then later when you trigger standby you can standby over it. Just a fantastic card. We want to see it at all times. Next, 2 copies of the 1-0 lane. This card is kind of busted, and if I had more room I'd probably play a third because it's just so good. So 2 effects, both of the effects happen on play and on death, which is the new power creep in Weiss Schwarz. Double utility timings, like kind of ridiculous. Both effects are good. So on play, on death, you can look at the top card of your deck and you can leave it there or send it to the waiting room. So she can just mill 2 on her own by her own effect. Notably, on death effect, you can do it when she crashes. So you can crash her in and then you can mill 1 at the end of your attack step, which means that you can, if it's like a clean card, you just mill clean damage. Kind of good. And then obviously if you see a standby or a climax, you can either brainstorm with her and hit it, or you can leave it there and trigger it. Second effect, on play, on death, pay 2, salvage anything you want. Turns out that this deck generates a lot of stock, and then sometimes we don't really have a good use for stock, and she's just a great way to refill hand and get whatever we want. She just converts our resources around really profitably, because a lot of times like standby decks will generate a lot of stock because they'll never lose board, so they never need to use stock brainstorming and getting resources. This deck especially does not need to use stock brainstorming because our brainstormer doesn't cost stock. So hilariously, we use the stock with the Elaine to get the hand back. A really excellent card. She's also 3,500 power, which kind of comes up like she's big enough, surprisingly. All right, and then 4 copies of the 2-2 bond. We have to run this bond because it's part of the combo, and it is also not a bad 2-2 at all. 2 copies of the 2-1 Elizabeth. You don't really need more than 2, but she's very important, especially in certain matchups where the anti-burn obviously comes into play. Also, the hexproof, really good at protecting our Meliodas at level 2. Enables us to front attack without any worry of like an anti-change counter or anything like that. Just really good card to have. Generally speaking, you want this in your hand, so you can hard play it after standbying out a Meliodas, but obviously having it in waiting room is not too bad, because if you trigger a standby, or you can also standby out once you have a Meliodas. But generally speaking, if you have this in hand, you can just standby out on the second Meliodas, which is better. Yeah, very important card. In some matchups, you actually prioritize this a lot. Something that you just need to kind of be aware of, like how much do you need this card, how early do you need the card, and just to prioritize it accordingly. And then of course 3 copies of the 2-1 Elizabeth counter. This is one of the main reasons we're playing this deck, is because the Meliodas now has a defensive counter. The -2 soul is really good. The cost is also very cheap because it's all very named, so it's like a traded character, not just like any discard, and then you can only target the Meliodas to give the -2 soul. So the -2 soul ends up being extremely cheap. It's just discard 1 card, and I mean, we just have so many cards we want to discard, like the 2-2 bond. Generally speaking, I'm almost always dropping a 2-2 bond for the 2-1 counter, and yeah, it just enables this deck to have such strong defensive presence. You just never die from anything in any situation really. If you have the Meliodases and you have the counters, you're just in a really good spot. Generally speaking, you just hold the counter starting from level 1, because at level 2 then you can use them pretty proactively. And turns out that all your sculpting in this deck just naturally adds these to your hand, because like, thinking about it, you're playing this to discard these cards, and the cards that you're drawing are just other copies of your utility or like the good cards you want. And so eventually you're just going to draw into the good cards you want. Without really having to go out of my way to look for these counters, I'll enter level 3 with 2 or 3 of them in my hand, just because I'm constantly filtering out cards I don't want and getting new cards into my hand. And what better new cards to add to my hand than the 2-1. 3 copies just enables us to see most of them throughout the course of the game. I don't think you need more, and I definitely would not run any less. 4 copies of 3-2 Meliodas. Not much needs to be said about this card. It's crazy good in this shell because we can get out early, we can protect it, has hexproof, has anti-burn, it can give our opponents -2 soul. Good times. Alright, and then 1 copy of 3-2 Elaine. This is kind of a matchup decision, basically against decks that just want to soul rush and like bum rush us. We can standby this out at level 2, try to stabilize and heal every single turn. It's also a kind of like a third Elizabeth in terms of getting extra power, but mostly this is here for the double heal. You can play it from hand to heal and then pay 2, rest it to heal again. So just a great card for us to stabilize when we're behind on damage but ahead in most other metrics of the game. Definitely could be a different card, but generally speaking, this kind of fills the bill in terms of what this deck is potentially lacking, which is kind of a good way to come back in the damage race, because the Meliodas combo is not very good at dealing extra instances of damage proactively. She's our comeback mechanic. Alright, and then for the climax spread, pretty straightforward. 4 copies of Back from the Dead. This is the preferred art because it's gorgeous. 2 copies of Caught in the Trap. You want to use Caught in the Trap because if your opponent doesn't know your deck, this could be the bond combo, and that's pretty spooky. In fact, you can actually remove this Elaine and put in a bond combo if you want, just to scare the living shits out of your opponent. And of course, 2 copies of Full Counter. This is also the preferable art. This art's really good. So yeah, this is the deck. Very simple, very straightforward. Lots of foils, lots of consistency, and lots of fun times. So starting at level 0, for the mulligan, there are exactly 2 ways to mulligan in this deck. Very, very important. You either keep exactly 1 copy of the Escanor, and that means that the rest of your hand was shit. So you just keep the 1 Escanor. Or if you have either Elaine, you keep the Elaine, and you try to mulligan for the other one. And then you always keep specifically Back from the Dead because it's a part of our Elaine combo, and you mill everything else. So once again, there's 2 different types of hands that you keep in this hand. So if you see either Elaine or the climax, you mill everything but Elaine's, and 1 of each Elaine and the climax. Or if you don't see any of those, you keep the Escanor as a good turn 1 play. And you mill everything else. Everything else goes in the bin. You want to see, ideally see Elaine and then the climax as soon as possible, right? So turn 1 clock, you need to clock red. And this is why we need to run as much red as possible. And this is why, yeah, it's really bad when we don't have red, because even if you don't have this climax, if we clock yellow and then draw into the climax, we're in a very bad state. We always want to be able to stand by turn 1. So you always clock red. Even if it's your second Elaine, even if it's one of these, if it's the only one of these, you still try your best to clock red. Generally speaking, it's okay to clock a 2/2, even if we don't have any 2/2s in waiting room. There's still ways to get them into waiting room. It's not a big deal, but we want to clock red. Ideally, if we can use the Elaine or the Meliodas to kind of start filtering, we do that, and we use the Elaine Brainstorm turn 1, kill off one of these Brainstorm. If we hit, that's great. We just start turboing off. If we miss, that's fine. Just attack once. You know, if the 5th card's a standby, we can standby out one of our standby targets, preferably the one with Elizabeth. If it's not standby, then that's great. That means we milled 5 clean cards, and we have a great chance of canceling at level 0. The rest of our deck is filled with standby that will eventually trigger on this deck cycle and rotation. The rubber banding in first deck is going to be really good for us. Okay, so that's how we play our level 0. You just want to kind of get off to the races as soon as possible. Be explosive. Don't be afraid to do that. One thing you do not want to do though in this deck is double Brainstorm if you don't know that your second Brainstorm is going to hit. So your first Brainstorm every turn is basically free. You'll get it, especially once you start winning board. You just get to do it for fun if you want. Don't second Brainstorm unless you're completely clean and you just need a mill, or unless you reveal a climax with the Meliodas. Because if you start double Brainstorming every turn, then you're going to lose hand very quickly, and this deck's not very good at rebuilding hand if you're just going to minus for no reason. So generally speaking, just limit yourself to single Brainstorm. You want to play a standby every turn, so generally speaking, you want one of your back rows to be empty, so you're standbying as a +1 rather than just a wash. Just don't double Brainstorm if possible, right? If you do double Brainstorm, usually you want just to kill an Elaine with your other Elaine, right? Never trust anybody, even yourself. If you have the climax, you can potentially kill something else and have 2 Elaines in the back row to double salvage the bond, and then stand by something else over it. That's an option, especially if you're going into refresh and you want the bonds to be available as soon as the second refresh. All right, and then level 1, you know, just stand by at level 2, pretty simple. Level 1 is honestly not a great place for this deck to be. You kind of want to be at level 0 for as long as possible, and then just kind of go to level 2 as soon as possible. So you don't want to be stuck at 1. And good thing, this deck can get you unstuck from 1 pretty easily with the Escanors to clock yourself, and also with the Elaine to like speed through your deck. At level 1, you don't want to spend too much time, and you want to get to level 2 sooner rather than later, because starting from level 2, we can set up the really strong Meliodas and Elizabeth board and start kind of denying our opponent with the counters. Once we hit level 2, we just definitely want to get every single Meliodas out into Axis, either on the board or into our hands to play at level 3. And then, yeah, we just want to protect it with the Elizabeths, the counter, and also this Elizabeth to run it around, denying our opponent the ability to adachi it in any way. And then once we hit level 3, we just play the rest of our Meliodases, and a lane if we need extra healing. And then we don't actually need to get the choice. It's great if we can get the choice, but don't go out of your way to get it at the cost of like our own survivability. With the counter, we're the deck that gets to live the longest and have the last laugh. So a lot of the times I win this game by my opponent scooping, because my opponent will actually just straight up be out of resources and they're like, I can't win. And then they'll just scoop and they say, you got it. And that's how this deck wins. Like, we don't actually win by dealing lethal damage to our opponent. We win by opponent scooping and giving up because they can't kill us and they're out of resources. So that's basically how this deck works. So don't go out of your way to get the choice. Just get it if it's convenient. Like if you brainstorm and see one, or if you have a climax swap, you can go into it, then that's great. But generally speaking, I would prioritize getting more counters and getting like triple Meliodas and the Elizabeth over getting the choice to try to quote unquote go for a game, because it's not that reliable and you're better off just playing defense. This deck will survive basically any onslaught, barring some like crazy Tokyo Avengers or Escanor shenanigans, and it will live to tell the tale. So yeah, that's it for this deck profile. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys give this deck a try, especially now while it's still really good. In the future, there's going to be more decks introduced into English that might make this deck potentially a lot worse. Data Live 8 win, oh my goodness. But yeah, anyways, while the deck is good, go ahead and play it. This deck absolutely destroys Quince, absolutely obliterates and shits on Nino standby. It's like you cannot lose that matchup. It's almost impossible to lose. The deck does very well against Kanta Marine, especially with the level 0 bond, pushing the Meliodas power level over the Kantas. They basically cannot maintain their board at level 2, and they are just going to be losing a lot of resources rather than gaining a lot of resources. This deck does very well against Attack on Titan because none of the Attack on Titan combos work very favorably into our end game. They're all burns, and turns out that stopping those burns makes this deck very good. They also can't really get a lot of advantage at level 2 with their early plays and their changers because, haha, 1-1 Elizabeth. And so we have a good time. This deck does not do that great against Escanor. I kind of talked about why 2 of my losses at Worlds was against Escanor. That's because against Escanor, this deck is actually pretty even on paper because we stopped some of their shenanigans with the minus soul counter and the hexproof not allowing them to bounce our front row. And then they stopped some of our shenanigans with the Escanor just not caring about the anti-burn text on our Elizabeth. However, that deck does have the advantage because it has the 2 soul triggers to pressure us early game and potentially hit us into a damage deficit sooner rather than later, and it just can get all the resources it needs to finish us while we're not completely set up yet. So that is kind of how the matchup goes. However, if we do get ahead and we're able to stabilize, then they end up bleeding a lot of resources and then we have the win. So I would say it's like maybe 45-55 or 40-60 at worst. So it's a pretty fair and even matchup, but we are definitely not the favored ones in that matchup. So maybe there's some ways we can tweak this deck to have a better chance at that matchup. I haven't really thought about it too much. Maybe we actually just need more copies of this Elizabeth so that they can't bounce our front row. But yeah, enjoy this deck while it's good. I highly recommend you guys give it a shot. It's really, really fun. Plays so differently from any other standby deck. I just had a really great time playing this at Worlds. All my games were bangers, and I hope all of your games with this deck are bangers as well. That's it from me. Once again, Chairman here, Simu signing off. Had a blast. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys next time. Peace!